What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about prospects. I want to talk a little bit about the top prospects list within franchise mode, and I also want to talk about when you should be considering calling players up to the major league level, development, and those things. And these are all things that I've addressed in prior videos. So those videos are definitely out there if you want to watch extended videos on those topics. But nonetheless, I felt that it was important to address this because I still do get a lot of comments discussing when should I call certain players up based on performance, things of that nature. And I want to give you guys a few benchmarks based off of my franchise that you guys can take a look at and potentially utilize to help inform your decisions within franchise mode. So first and foremost, I actually want to take a look at the top prospects list because I feel like that gives us a pretty solid idea of where the best prospects stand within the league, where they're going to be in terms of their organization, whether it be the MLB or the minor league system, and when those players are actually getting called up. So in order to get there, we scroll over 2 times to the right in order to get to this logo. We're going to click on it and we're going to go down to top prospects. When we get to top prospects here, it's going to show us a list of all the top prospects within the league. Obviously, we have quite a few on here because we've done a really good job of developing our team to this point, but this actually gives us a really good idea that we can then cross-reference with our roster for you guys to take a look at when players are getting called up to the major leagues. The first prospect on this list is going to be our catcher, Henry Davis, who when we click triangle on these players is going to be an 80 overall with a potential. Now, Henry Davis is at the MLB level for us. When a player reaches this point that they're an 80 overall, you almost have no choice but to bring them up to your major league roster. They're really not going to develop a whole lot beyond this point within the minor league system. They may develop a little bit more, but nonetheless, you're probably better off for almost any team in the game utilizing that player that is that high overall on your MLB roster, because chances are there's a spot for them somewhere that you can utilize that player and get something out of them. Now, when we take a look at the other players that are at this level, that are at the top of the entire top prospects list here, we're looking at high 70s players, and a lot of them are technically up at the major league level. So we can actually look at Adley Rutschman, for example, who's a 79 overall, and he is also a catcher. He's also up at the major league level as a 79 with a potential. He's now 25 years old, but nonetheless, you can see that as we approach that high 70s to 80 overall, you're almost just screaming to get into the majors. There's not really a whole lot of reason to hold that player down. This should certainly be the point where you're looking to, at the very least, utilize this player in some way on your major league roster. And nonetheless, I want you guys to just know that at the very least, if you kind of struggle with this idea or you need helpful information with this concept, you can always come to the top rankings system here, the top 50 players, and you can get an idea for when other players in the league are getting called up to their teams. Now, keep in mind, this is going to vary position by position. Some positions are weaker than others. Catcher, for example, is very hard to find a good catcher throughout the league. I mean, they're fewer and far between, and therefore they might get called up a little bit more readily than other positions that have fantastic players across the league. So we do want to keep that in mind, that this does vary position by position, and 2 of the top players that I've showed you now are slightly older. You can see 23 years old and 25 years old, and they're at one of those high demand positions. But nonetheless, you can also see that Mason Martin, for example, is a high 70 player, and we now have him in the major leagues. Quinn Priester is a 73, and he's knocking on the door of being in the major leagues. He's not quite there yet for us, but you can see that we really start to get into all these players. Jack Leiter is in the major leagues as a 75 overall. You really start to, in the 70s for these players, get into decision making. Luis Gill is a 76 overall, and he is definitely in the majors. CJ Abrams here is a 72, and he's in the minors. So you can really get a good understanding of kind of like that 75 and above is really where you want to be looking to call players up. 70 to 75, you may be considering it. They may not be quite ready yet, but for some teams that are weaker at certain positions, it might be justifiable to bring that player up to the major major leagues. Now, generally, below about a 70 overall, you're not going to bring a whole lot of players up to the majors. Now, we certainly know that that's not always going to be the case, because in some scenarios, you're going to have to fill out your roster with lower overall players. That's just the reality of the situation. Whenever we take a look at just about any roster in a league, you might find a player that's below a 70 overall. I only had to scroll over one team here to the Brewers in order to find a player on their MLB roster that's below a 70, and we're taking a look at 2 relief pitchers here, and that is certainly going to be by demand. Whenever we scroll over to take a look at their relief staff, they just don't really have anything better, and so by demand, they have to play players that are below a 70. That's going to happen, especially for teams that have a certain position that's weaker, teams that are maybe rebuilding, things of that nature. You may have lower overall players up at the major leagues, so this does adjust depending on what your team looks like, depending on your team composition, and depending on the position, like I said. So really, I just primarily wanted to point you guys towards the top prospect list as a good tool to gauge whether you should be calling a certain player up or not against other overalls within the league and who's being called up. Now, when we actually take a deep dive look at a roster, for example, you get into a lot of decision points, and really, it's just a matter of performance, and it's a matter of, is it worth it to bring that player up, and can you give them enough playing time to continue their development? As we know, and as we've discussed in many, many videos, in order to develop players within an MLB The Show, you do have to give them a significant amount of playing time. If you call a player up to simply be a DH, or simply bat off of the bench, they may not progress for you. They will get some natural progression points on their own through training and through having a high development, but they're going to develop faster if they play and if they play well. So you have to consider that whenever you're deciding to call a player up. When we take a look at our starting pitcher rotation here on the Pirates, for example, we have a battle right now of Quinn Priester potentially getting to the major league roster, but I'm deciding not to bring him up quite yet. There's a very big decision point here that we have to make with these players, and there's a reason that I'm bringing up Adonis Medina first and allowing Quinn Priester to stay down there in the minor leagues for a little while. First and foremost, we know that players can progress up to and close to an 80 overall within the minor league system. We saw that with Henry Davis at catcher, up to an 80 overall A potential in his time in the minor leagues for us last season without touching him as a player. So we know that players can progress up to that point. Well, here's what I want to say. Is it more likely for him to perform well down there in AAA and have very good performance and advance his development at that AAA level as a 73 overall A potential, or is it more likely for him to do that as a 73 overall A potential facing major league bats? And the simple answer here is that this is a pretty clear decision point. I'm going to go with the guy that has C potential, that is more disposable to my organization, and I'm going to allow him to take that load of the 5th pitcher in the rotation because I'm not that confident that I'm going to perform that well with Quinn Priester. I'm more confident that he's going to perform well as the ace pitcher down there in the AAA system, and he's going to vault his development forward, and hopefully at some point during the season, he'll be a mid to high 70s overall player, maybe even getting to an 80 at some point, that we can then call up and we'll know that we'll have success with him when he gets to the major league level. And if you follow my franchise modes, you may be familiar with the decision making with my infield players within this franchise mode with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Last season, we decided to call up Tucupita Marcano, who's only a C potential player. At the time, he was maybe a 68 overall or something of that nature. Not the greatest player, but he was performing really well in the minor leagues, and that translated into very solid performance whenever he came up to the MLB roster. But we have players that are better than that I could have called up to the major league level, guys like Cole Tucker and Liover Peguero. And if we go over to second base, we also had guys like Nick Gonzalez and Ji-Hwan Bai that I was not calling up to the major league level. And on a very basic sense, if I was telling you at a certain overall to call up every single player, you might be more tempted to call up a Nick Gonzalez than a Tucupita Marcano. But The decision factor here comes into play thinking about what's in front of those players. So at first base, we were pretty confident in the combination we had between Mason Martin and Daniel Vogelbach, so there's certainly no room for somebody to come up and play at that position. There's certainly really no room for anybody to DH when Daniel Vogelbach played really well at that position for us. And at second base, we were pretty stacked up with Michael Chavis and Diego Castillo, who were performing well, so we had no need to change what was going on there. And this year we brought in Rougned Odor to help us out as a bench bat. He's older, he's not going to progress a lot. And at third base, Ke'Bryan Hayes is a given to start, and at shortstop, O'Neal Cruz has progressed phenomenally for us. So really, where is there any position for a young player to come up and get a significant amount of playing time that is going to allow them to develop to the point that we want them to? That just isn't really there for us in this system, so we can trust that we're probably going to get more development out of guys like Cole Tucker and Liover Peguero and Nick Gonzalez and Ji-Hwan Bai down there in the minor league system, where they are going to get a significant amount of playing time, where they are going to have opportunities for DH reps and starting reps and things of that nature. I would love to call up a Nick Gonzalez. He has a pretty solid skill set, but right now, I just don't have anywhere to put him, and he certainly still has a few overall points of development ahead of him, and he's young enough that I'm not really hurting myself by leaving him down there in the minor leagues. So again, this is still a very subjective process. I'm not saying that at a 75 overall, you have to call up every single player. Certainly, at an 80 overall, you don't even have to call up Henry Davis. Now, you're risking at that point not really developing that player much further. But I have Reese McGuire in front of him. I could have technically gone the veteran route, and I could have left him down in the minor leagues for a little while longer. There's nothing saying that I can't do that, but it is worth considering that at a certain overall point, the benefit outweighs the potential development that he could get in the minor leagues. His development potential at the majors now is far and away better than it could have been in the minors now at this point. But there's a trade-off there with other positions where we talked about second base, for example. You're probably going to get more development out of a Ji-Hwan Bai with a potential down there in the minor leagues than you will up at the majors. So again, it's subjective, but utilize that top 50 prospects list, press triangle on those players to get information on them to inform your decisions on when you're going to call a player up or not. Utilize their performance as a metric. Do you need a player at the MLB level to help perform? Get rid of somebody else and bring that guy up if he's performing well and you want to provide a spark to the team. There's a couple of different ways that you can approach it, but I definitely wanted to insert this discussion video because I know I've talked about this before, but it's helpful to continue to discuss this topic. And certainly, I want to hear your guys' strategies down in the comment section below. Is it strictly overall based? Is it more performance based? Or is it something else that drives your decisions to call players up or leave them in the minors? I'd love to hear all that information from you guys. And make sure you guys leave a like on this video if you did enjoy this discussion topic and if you enjoy these types of informative videos. As well, comment down below, like I said, and subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. As always, I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.